Hi everybody, this is my response to our critical thinking chapter, chapter 15, and my key idea, the one that fascinates me, is key idea number 9. We often pursue power through dominating or submissive behavior. As Paul notes on page 346, power is in itself not really egocentric or bad, and to some extent it's mostly the pursuit of power. But it's interesting in knowledge because Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish says there's no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. And it's the idea that knowing is related to power, and power is constituted by types of knowing, and that when we claim a field of knowledge, we are claiming a type of power in that field, which I find interesting because that's sort of, I think, what Paul is doing with critical thinking, is he's creating, or maybe creating is not the word, capitalizing on the power that goes with being a critical thinker. When he talks about critical thinking and power, he talks about bullying and groveling, how we tend to be ways of pursuing power, either by bullying people into submission or being the submissive one who, well, basically willingly submits for whatever crumbs fall their way. These are common. We see this. They're often passive-aggressive means of gaining power. And I think Paul himself falls trapped to his ideas of power. As Foucault was saying, when you create or try to constitute a field of knowledge, you are in fact constituting a power relationship there. And one of the things Paul does with critical thinking is create it as a tool to achieving power. And I don't, as he says, that's not bad, but it can be problematic. And it talks about bullying, and bullying is clearly a problematic play for power, and it's clearly egocentric, a way to enhance oneself. It also has sociocentric ties in that we often are bullied when a group get together, and groupthink is in fact a type of bullying, and it is a type of power. So there is a lot of power involved with this. I was amused by his example about the crowds at the concert, because it always reminds me of Hegel's universal spirit, and I'm not quite sure why he thinks this is actually a useful example, except for how it shows we unconsciously fall into this trap of thinking about power and falling for power. But it's mostly when we are in that crowd and we are at that rock concert, we are not thinking in terms of the power struggle or the power situation or the power relations. We are giving into a movement, an irrational movement and feeling that makes us feel good, which is, of course, egocentric in nature. But even as Paul says and grants, we're egocentric. He talks about how we may admire people and how we shouldn't idolize them, because rational people, as he says on 346, form alliances, but not ones in which they are dominated. And his idea of power is, to me, kind of fascinating, because he is trying to have some sort of equality here in his power relationships. But then he follows that up when he starts talking about the power relationships between men and women. And he falls into that power trap. He says traditional male and female sex role conditioning entails the man dominating the woman and the woman playing a submissive role towards her man. Very phrasing there falls into that power trap. He himself used a couple of pages back. An example that is, let me see. I had it marked, but I lost. Ah, yes. The example on page 333, when he's just talking in general about strategically thinking our way through and applying critical thinking to our own acts, is the husband and wife at the video store, which is so stereotypical and falls right into the power trap of male-female power traps. Paul himself falls into his trap. But he is right. We have to be careful, and we all have some desire for power, and we have to watch ourselves from doing these sorts of behaviors. I myself am particularly bad at interrupting, which is an attempt to dominate and an attempt to bully. And it doesn't matter. I work in academia, so their power stakes are tiny. But we still try, because power is our way of enhancing our sociocentric status and our egocentric needs. So I think we have to be aware of power. I think we have to recognize it in ourselves and in others, that it is egocentric thought. We need to pay attention to them so that we can focus on those who wish to attain power for unethical reasons. The old quote is, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there is truth to that. Cliches stick around for a reason. So with Paul's chapter 9, our key idea 9, what I often find is that we have to look at power situations and deconstruct them to see who is and how is that power working. That goes perfectly hand in hand with what I think about when it comes to the punk pedagogy and working in resistance. And one of the Foucault quotes that I found when looking for things comes from the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and it is, where there is power, there is resistance. And that may end up my title. It'll certainly end up in my capstone, because I think that is exactly where it is. And I think that's one of the reactions I have to Paul, is his entire critical thinking plan is, in fact, it creates a sort of power structure that I find myself automatically resisting. As egocentric as that may be, as sociocentric as that may be, critical thinking is important, but Paul's predication of everything on it and its use as I don't want to say a solve-all, but he does present it as the ultimate solution, is somewhat blinding and is a power structure that I find myself called to resist. So those are my thoughts on Paul and power. Now I'm going to go be a punk.